We're now going to talk about tax incidence. When we talk about tax incidence, we're talking about whose pocket does the tax really come out of. Okay, and it might not be who actually writes the check. All right? In this first example, we're going to look at the tax being collected from the seller, meaning the seller of the good actually writes the check to the government. All right? Well, to start out with, we've got this good here. All right? Here's a supply, demand, equilibrium is 10 units. Price of this good, whatever it is, I don't know, let's say Twinkies, is $1. Now, in order, looking at the supply curve, that means in order for the firm to be willing to produce 10 units, they need to receive $1. All right. Now let's suppose a 50-cent tax is imposed on Twinkies, and the Twinkie company has to pay this tax. And the government does this because they think Twinkies is bad for you, and they want to encourage people not to eat them. All right. The 50-cent tax per unit of Twinkies. Now, what would the price need to be now for Twinkies to be willing to produce 10 units? Well, $1 plus the 50-cent tax, right? If they could sell Twinkies for $1.50, they would still be willing to produce 10 because they would pay the 50-cent tax. They'd still end up with $1. In other words, the supply curve, is going to shift up by the amount of the tax. Since the tax is 50 cents, it's going to shift up 50 cents. And we can see that if they can charge this price up here, they'd get their $1.50, pay the 50-cent tax, and they're right back to $1. That's what they have to continue to produce 10 units. But consumers are part of this. Consumers aren't going to go along necessarily, raise the price on them, and what are they going to say? Well, maybe we're not going to buy Twinkies anymore, or not as many. And consumer behavior is modeled by the demand curve. We've got this downward sloping demand curve. And as a result, we have a new equilibrium right here. Let's say 8 Twinkies. And that's $1.25. All right. So, if the firm is now able to raise the price to $1.25, that means they're going to pay a tax of 50 cents. So what do they get? What do they end up with? 75 cents. So let's take a look at the result here. Before the tax, the consumer paid $1, and the producer received $1. So what's the story after the 50-cent tax was imposed on the seller? Well, the consumer now paid $1.25, and the producer ends up receiving 75 cents. So how much effectively comes out of the consumer's pocket? What's the difference between what they paid after the tax was imposed and what they paid before? Well, that's $1.25 minus $1. So the tax incidence to the consumer is 25 cents. Well, how about the producer? Before the tax, the producer received $1. After the tax, they end up with 75 cents. The tax incidence to the producer is 25 cents. Now let's do the same analysis, except for this time the tax is actually collected from the consumer. It's the consumer that writes the check and sends it in to the IRS, all right? Now, if the price is $1, consumers are willing to consume 10 units of Twinkies. Now, if a 50-cent tax is imposed upon them, what does the price have to be for consumers to continue to be willing to buy the 10 Twinkies? Well, that would be just the price minus the tax, right? So the price would have to be 50 cents, and then they would pay the 50-cent tax, and they'd end up paying $1 just like they did before. And if they're paying $1 just like they did before, they would... Okay, I had an interruption there. Sorry about that. Let's continue forward. So we've got the 50-cent price plus the 50-cent tax. That puts the consumer right back at $1, and that's what they care about. If they don't care how the price is configured, or what proportion goes as tax and what proportion goes to the producer, you just care about how much leaves your pocket, right? So if $1 leaves the consumer's pocket, the consumer is willing to buy 10 units. However, the producer has something to say about this. That's if the price falls to 50 cents. But what we've got is the supply curve to deal with. So what happens here is the demand curve shifts down by the amount of the tax. And here's our new equilibrium. That's 8. And we have 75 cents. The price is now 75 cents, and 8 units is the equilibrium quantity. But we're not done. Remember, the consumer has to pay a 50-cent tax. So the price is 75 cents, that's the equilibrium, but the consumer is going to have to pay that 50-cent tax. So 75 cents plus 50 cents, that's $1.25. So let's analyze this. Before the tax was imposed, the consumer paid $1, and the producer received $1. Now there's a 50-cent tax on the consumer, so the demand curve shifts down by 50 cents. Now the consumer ends up paying $1.25, and the firm, the producer, ends up receiving 75 cents. The tax incidence, well, what's the difference between what the consumer paid before and after the tax? 25 cents. What's the difference between what the producer receives before and after the tax? 25 cents. Now this should look awfully familiar because this is exactly the result we had when the tax was collected from the producer. The tax incidence is the same. It doesn't matter who actually writes the check. The tax incidence doesn't change either way. Now this was a really big deal with the Affordable Care Act. Politically, they weren't getting anywhere trying to tax insurance policies. But when they figured out that, hey, the American people aren't the most economically illiterate, they said, let's tell them we'll tax the insurance companies. Well, yeah, go ahead and tax insurance companies. Just don't tax my policy. Well, be sure to read the little mini lecture about tax incidence and the ACA. It talks about Jonathan Gruber, a little video there of him explaining this. And he got all kinds of heat about this. But, he's just an economist. He's just an economist explaining economics. But the politicians weren't too happy because they didn't exactly want this to be known. But as he explains, the tax incidence didn't matter. It doesn't matter if you tax insurance companies or tax the insurance policies. The tax incidence is the same. So the economics, it's all the same. The politics, however, very different indeed.